very nice too. This meeting is being recorded. Oh, there's Bill. Hello. Hello.
Hello. Good morning.
Hi, Bill. Morning.
Welcome to day 2 of this webinar, revisiting Muriel Rukeyser's Elegies in times like these. Just in case you weren't able to be with us yesterday, I would like to repeat some of my thanks. Some new things have accrued over yesterday. But first of all, my name is Elizabeth Deumer. I am a faculty in the English department at Eastern Michigan University and a member of the Women's and Gender Studies department. And I am the creator of the Muriel Rukeyser Living Archive website. I have a lot of people to thank, so let me just do it very briefly. First of all, the College of Arts and Sciences at EMU, the Center for Jewish Studies, the English department, the Women's and Gender Studies department. I want to thank my assistant, Casey Miller. I want to thank my Rukeyser friend, Trudy Witonsky, for helping me think things through. I want to thank my co-hosts. Oh my God, you make this possible. Christine Neufeld, Meg Dobbins, Daniel Patrick. I want to thank all the moderators, facilitators, the panelists, the keynotes, colleagues, students, all the attendants. And I very much want to thank Bill Rukeyser for his continuing support of all of these ventures at Eastern Michigan University. And we had wonderful speakers and wonderful times yesterday. And so we have a very full day. And let me, without further ado, introduce to you Catherine Gander, who is going to introduce our keynote speaker, Rowena Kennedy-Epstein. So Catherine Gander comes to us from Maynooth in Ireland, Maynooth University in Ireland. And Rowena is from England today, so we have a truly international gathering. Catherine Gander is Associate Professor of American Literature at Maynooth University. She is the author of the award-winning monograph, Muriel Rukeyser and Documentary, The Poetics of Connection, published by Edinburgh Press in 2013. She's the co-editor of Mixed Messages, American Correspondences in Visual and Verbal Practices at Manchester University Press, 2016. And she is currently working on 2 scholarly books, the companion to Don DeLillo and the Arts, under contract with Edinburgh University Press, and a monograph, Aesthetics of Displacement, Poetry, Art, Hybridity, which explores the social intermediate poetics of women, including Doris Salcedo, I might not pronounce her name correctly, Cecilia Vicuña, Layli Long Soldier, Muriel Rukeyser, Claudia Rankine, and Teresa Ha-Kyung Cha. Her literary criticism, artwork, and poetry can be found in a number of publications, including Ink, Sweat, and Tears, One Hand Clapping, Juniper Poetry, Ireland Review, Wolf Poetry Magazine, and the Irish Times. She is also the chair of the All-Ireland Irish Association for American Studies. Thank you so much, Catherine.
Oh, thank you, Elizabeth. And thank you everyone for being here, and thank you for inviting me to introduce Rowena and to chair this really special keynote. Before I start, I did want to say a little thank you to Elizabeth, because you bring a lot of people together, Elizabeth, and I know how much energy and time, and most of it is unseen and unacknowledged, goes into projects like this. So I think I speak for all of us when I say that we're in your debt. The website, the events that you've organized, the networks you've built, the publications you've brought about, the conversations that you've facilitated, the way you consistently and tirelessly bring people together. Well, we're here because of you, and the community that you have forged is something that I'm really happy and really proud to be a part of. So I just wanted to say thank you, Elizabeth. And there are a lot of people clapping you. And now it gives me very great pleasure to introduce another woman whose work I deeply admire. I first met Rowena Kennedy-Epstein in 2014, I think, when I was chairing a panel at the American Literature Association in Washington, DC. And I met several fantastic Rukeyser scholars who would go on to be friends and collaborators. We've done a lot of work together, and I think we're going to do a lot more work together. And I remember being really struck immediately by Rowena's energy and by her like incredibly sharp intelligence. And after that, a supportive, hopefully mutually enriching friendship grew as we found shared ground in research, in life experiences, being the mothers of wonderful boys, and both working in UK universities, which perhaps we can share those ideas another time. It's no exaggeration to say that Rowena's recovery and publishing of Muriel Rukeyser's lost novel Savage Coast has shaped the landscape of scholarship, not only on Rukeyser, but on the Spanish Civil War, on women's writing, and on the hybrid novel form, and more besides, I think. The book exemplifies what is so admirable about Rowena's research. It is deeply committed to doing the feminist work, to the retrieval, to the reevaluation, to the amplification, and the celebration of women's writing, to dismantling the heteronormative patriarchal structures of oppression and abuse across all our areas of experience that have muted, buried, devalued, and delimited women's voices for centuries. To borrow a phrase from her forthcoming book, Dr. Rowena Kennedy-Epstein is the real thing. Whenever I read her work, I strain my neck from nodding so vigorously, and I really do. She has that rare gift of getting to the heart of the matter with such eloquence and insight, with such passion and precision, that you come away from her work knowing more, not just about the subject, but about the world, and therefore about yourself. And this is something I feel when I read Muriel Rukeyser too. So it is especially wonderful, and perhaps little wonder, that her legacy lives on so radiantly in Rowena. Rowena Kennedy-Epstein, for those of you who do not know, is Senior Lecturer in Gender Studies and 20th and 21st Century Women's Writing at the University of Bristol in the UK. She recovered and edited Rukeyser's novel Savage Coast, published by Feminist Press in 2013, and is the author of My Unfinished Spirit, Muriel Rukeyser Between Archive and Authorship, which is forthcoming from Cornell University Press. She's currently working on an edition and exhibition of Rukeyser's phototext collaboration with Berenice Abbott, and is co-editing Rukeyser's selected prose. After Rowena's keynote, I'm going to moderate the Q&A. So panelists from the conference are able to put their cameras and their mics on to ask a question. So you can kind of raise your hand, I think the little yellow hand, to ask a question. But conference attendees are able to ask a question by using the Q&A rather than the chat. So I just want to underline that. I think we're looking at the Q&A rather than the chat box. Okay. So I will open up the floor to questions, but please feel free to enter the discussion after the keynote is finished. I've had the privilege of a sneak preview of Rowena's lecture today, so I know we're all in for a treat. She'll be drawing from her fantastic forthcoming book, which has at its heart the vital message that a woman's published work must be understood as a fraction of the work that she has produced, and that we must turn to the archive as a primary source to understand not just what has been kept from us in the past, but what is being repressed in our current moment. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Rowena Kennedy-Epstein, who is speaking to us on Muriel Rukeyser's Unfinished Modernism. So Rowena, it's over to you.
Thank you. I'm stunned. That was such a generous introduction. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Louise, yesterday. One of the best parts of working on Rukeyser is working in a community, which is, I think, something she always advocated for. I think of her phrase about facing each other, and here we all are, literally facing each other. But now I'm going to share my screen, so I'll become a small head and not face you quite as much. Let's see if it all works. All right. All right, so I'm going to begin with a quote from the first elegy, Rotten Lake. When you have left the river, you are a little near the lake, but I leave many times. Parents parried my past. The present was poverty. The future depended on my unfinished spirit. There were no misgivings because there was no choice, only regret for waste and the wild knowledge, growth and sorrow and discovery. Today, I'm going to read from my forthcoming book, as Catherine noted, which is about the politics of Rukeyser's reception in the Cold War period, the unfinished nature of so much of the prose writing she was producing and researching at the same time, and the continued urgency to reevaluate our own literary norms that remain informed by mid-century gendered and political orthodoxies. The title of my book, My Unfinished Spirit, comes from her first elegy, and many of the ideas and contexts in which I situate and theorize Rukeyser's experimental textual and political choices, from her continued return to the Spanish Civil War, to her engagement with indigenous art and culture, to her own theorizations of waste and process, are also central concerns of Elegies, a war years epic uniquely concerned with the processes of, quote, staying with the trouble, as Donna Haraway writes recently. One of the reasons we have failed to truly understand Rukeyser's resonance, I think, is because we have failed to understand the full effect and scope of how the gender politics of the Cold War period shaped and continue to shape our perception of her and her work. This is what my book sets out to explore, and I suppose ultimately redress, that her wasted, unfinished work tells the story of women in the 20th century, but it is also a story about how to live and make in the crises and connections of our own times. I'm gonna go black for a minute as I read. So not to overwhelm you with the eye. That was Rukeyser's eye. Anyone who doesn't know, Bernice Abbott took that photo with her super sight. So in a letter to Denise Levertov in 1965, Muriel Rukeyser writes, quote, I feel like being fat is a visible sign of my dark side. Levertov responds by saying, you actually give the impression of lioness grandeur, of hugeness, but not of ugly fatness. When I first read this in my early 20s, I was struck by the wicked perniciousness of sexism, that two of the 20th century's most exciting and radical women poets would spend time talking about their bodies in such a way depressed me to no end. But of course, now I realize that's not actually what they were writing about. They were really writing, what does it mean to be a woman who takes up space, not just physical space, but intellectual, verbal, literary, and political space? And what does taking up that space imply about desires, appetites, affiliations, bodily acts, and artistic impulses? In Rukeyser's first and only novel, Savage Coast, written through a formal approach that could not be classified by any one genre, one that exceeded the boundaries of form, she writes of how it feels to be a, quote, big, angry woman. Her editor, as we know, rejected the novel in 1937 based on a reader report that had described it as BAD, bad, and abnormal. After one of the first lectures I gave on my recovery of the lost unfinished novel and the reasons for its initial rejection, someone from the audience approached me and said, I studied with Muriel. She was a wonderful teacher, but so ugly. Others have spoken of the difficult and expansive unevenness of her work in context of her difficult personality. And reviewers of her work in public and private also mistook her literary output for her gender manifestations, writing of her body and her sexuality while criticizing her texts and her politics, so that it can be difficult to tell what is under review. Her inability to conform to gender orthodoxies or textual orthodoxies. She was called, as has been brought up, a Helen who was a lesbian, a hussy who wrote like a deflated Whitman, a denuded Sybil, and a, quote, the common woman of our century, a siren photographed in a sequin bathing suit. Criticism that both imbued her work and body with power while degrading that power at the same time. This critical doubledness occurs religiously in critiques of Rukeyser, figuring her as both a central and peripheral figure in the 20th century. It is no surprise then that Rukeyser herself would write about these reactions to her work and her body at the same time. What she muses on in the letter to Levertov near the end of her life about what her body exposes about her intellectual, sexual, and formal interests is an indication of how much gender politics has informed the reception of her work. This is a familiar story for feminist scholars to encounter and theorize, both within a subject and within ourselves. Through the recuperation and reevaluation of modernist women writers like Rukeyser, critics have developed a prolific and theoretically nuanced approach for thinking about the slippages between the literary act and the bodily act. The poet Anne Carson sums up this genre succinctly, writing that putting a door on the female mouth has been an important project of patriarchal culture from antiquity to the present, and that women have been thought to have two mouths. We have a long history of women writers taking the slippage and nurturing it, turning the interstitial into the avant-garde revelations and narrative proclamations that have transformed the way we read and write over the past 2 centuries. While we've theorized the conflation of body and aesthetic, traced a tradition, named and made a lineage, women's experiences of being gendered bodies are still the essential filter through which their works and lives are received and read. Thus, misogyny continues to cut across us in a myriad of ways, whether we like to admit it or not, whether we identify as male or female, whatever class or race position we occupy, it is there, quote, cutting off thinking, as Rukeyser would write, informing how we read and how we think. Our current public debates about women still center on what kind of voices and bodies are allowed to have power, and the ways in which the restrictions on those voices and bodies affect the kinds of artistic work, intellectual labor, and political activity that women produce, and that we as readers or viewers or citizens ultimately can access. These questions of access and agency remain the central crisis in our understanding of women's textual production and political power today, and they are essential to understanding the movements of the last century as they are to our own times. In examining Rukeyser's vast archive of unfinished texts, there is no way to understand the erasure of so much of her work without understanding how gender functioned at the inception and in the reception of women's writing during the Cold War, and how that informs our own thinking about gender in text today. The impact of this has come into renewed focus in our new, recent, and ongoing reckoning with how sexual harassment and gender bias not only shape women's careers, but political, legal, and cultural frameworks as well, as exemplified in the Me Too movement. One moment in particular has felt especially illuminating for me in thinking through larger questions of women's artistic production. A few months after the groundbreaking New York Times expose on the long and disturbing history of sexual harassment by the movie producer Harvey Weinstein, the actor Salma Hayek published a testimonial. It was one painful story in a flood of testimony that, like all great floods, is changing our landscape. Hayek was writing about her experience directing and starring in the film about Frida Kahlo, whose radical avant-garde feminist modernist vision changed modern painting and how we view our women's artistic subjectivity. In the chilling New York Times op-ed, Hayek describes how Weinstein had pursued her for years after he agreed to produce her movie, asking her to have sex with another woman in front of him, among other humiliating fantasies. She refused each time. During filming, he began to demand things, and that she sexualize Kahlo, change her traditional Tehuana dress, modify her bold eyebrows. And then as she was finishing filming, Weinstein approached with an ultimatum. If Hayek did not add in a full frontal sex scene between Kahlo and the photographer Tina Modotti, played by Ashley Judge, he would kill the movie, shut it down, and bury it. Hayek wrote of having to make a choice: either capitulate to his humiliating fantasy and vicarious sexual assault in public for every viewer to see in perpetuity, or lose the self-defining artistic project she had worked on for years. How, she writes, after so many people had contributed, could she let all this, quote, magnificent work go to waste? She did the scene and went on to win an Oscar, securing Kahlo's status as a feminist cultural icon as well. In writing her Me Too story, Hayek exposed a truth about women's lives that is rarely articulated. It is a narrative about the struggle to produce work, to have a career, to be a public citizen under patriarchy, to say no. But she also exposes how the aesthetics, history, and politics of an artwork and an artist are shaped by the private, quote, tyrannies and servilities, as Virginia Woolf describes in Three Guineas. Hayek conveys how the artist and work are not metaphorically shaped, but quite literally, edited, altered, changed, redrawn by the desires, both singular, Weinstein's in this case, but global as well, to punish and humiliate women, particularly women who refuse to submit to the gender and artistic norms of their times. This is not a new revelation. In fact, one of Rukeyser's most famous lines, quote, "What would happen if a woman told the truth about her life? The world would split open," has become ubiquitous for framing Me Too stories. While this kind of silence breaking has been an essential part of previous women's liberation movements, what is new about this iteration is how effectively these stories have mapped the persistence of inequality in more exact ways for understanding the forces of change and reaction that have shaped the last 100 years. Hayek's sexual exploitation and abuse is written into Kahlo's narrative, into the narrative of Mexican modernism, and into Madati's narrative. Every viewer of the film will also sexualize Kahlo in the way that Weinstein wanted Hayek as Kahlo to be sexualized, a sexualization that Kahlo self-consciously struggled against in her own work and in her own life. So the effects of Weinstein's harassment influence multiple strands of women's history and aesthetic legacies. And Hayek's narrative shows us the precarious space between disappearance and visibility in which women's work exists. When I read Hayek's piece, I had recently found in Rukeyser's archive an unpublished essay on women writers titled Many Keys. Eric Pienigan has now made this available in Feminist Modernist Studies. The essay was commissioned by The Nation in 1957, but was ultimately rejected for submission for, quote, failing to communicate its point. In it, Rukeyser writes of two kinds of influences found in women's writing. One is the integration of the personal and political worlds. The other, she writes, fascinating and difficult to trace, consists of those influences rejected in the writer's work. We hardly have the biographical methods or the critical beginnings to let us perceive the struggle against influence and how these reactions may be used, turning rebellion, hostility, desires, begun in hatred and in fear, into the movements reaching art that may surpass their origins. Just as Hayek's narrative shows how her struggle against influence and capitulation to it was transformed into an aesthetic legacy, here Rukeyser in the Cold War 50s began to think towards such a critical stance, one that helps us read the complex gender politics of artistic production in the period, and then anticipates the feminist activism and literary criticism that would arise around her work in subsequent decades. The reading Rukeyser is describing takes into account the forces women writers have had to work against or with or in, the influences of teachers, critics, parents, editors, readers, lovers, mentors, as well as a literary heritage that positions women as object or audience and not the subject of literary and textual history. But she goes further, for she asks us to understand the aesthetic implications of such an influence. There is waste in nature, waste in art, and plenty of waste in the lives of women. Waste is an influence, and the making of poetry works against waste. By the time Rukeyser was commissioned to write Many Keys, she had become intimately aware of the gender politics of waste. Savage Coast, the reviewer wrote, has been a waste of time. And between the novel's rejection in 1937 and the 1960s, Rukeyser would produce a series of large-scale projects that were rejected for publication and that remain unfinished in her archive. Theoretically ambitious, multi-genre, sometimes collaborative, these texts continued the radical avant-garde project of modernism and traced a polyphonic American tradition that challenge an increasingly hegemonic Cold War culture. Ranging from her lost novel to her scientific phototext collaboration with Bernice Abbott, to her biography of the anthropologist Franz Boas, to her suppressed lectures on women writers, to canceled plays, unproduced films, television, and radio shows. Her work did not linger in obscurity for lack of authorial energy or talent, or editorial stubbornness. Instead, her archive discloses a history of revisions, pitches, and rejections, documents of her commitment to artistic and political vision in the face of an often hostile and sexist readership. By examining these unfinished works, their making, reception, and rejection, we are better able to understand how the gender norms of publishing practices, aesthetic dictates, literary canons, and disciplinary categories were formed during the Cold War period, and the ways in which Rukeyser resisted these constraints. Each of her unpublished works gives us a unique view of the conditions that produce a text's unfinishedness, the sexism of editors, the withdrawal of funding or publishing contracts, political censure or intellectual derision, motherhood, and economic precarity. And they are also bound together by Rukeyser's radical vision for artistic creation and political engagement, changing how we might read a period often defined by a conservative and gender and artistic ethos. Despite their original rejection, the texts are themselves aesthetically rich, unique in their narrative focus on marginalized peoples and voices, and intellectually rigorous. Collectively, these texts serve as examples of the important work that is lost when we undervalue women's cultural contributions. It is through the recovery of the unfinished, wasted texts that we can better understand how 20th century ideologies of exclusion have been formed through literary and academic values. But it is also through these texts that we can uncover the kinds of complex feminist approaches necessary for dismantling the very same values. These texts are rich sites of exploration for many reasons, but particularly for the alternative vision of the 20th century that they provide, and for the formal processes in which that vision is reached. These texts make me ask, what if it had been Rukeyser and not Adorno who had shaped our post-war thinking about culture and art and fascism? What if it had been the Rukeyser era and not the Pound era? What if we followed the unfinished and let it guide us to a more holistic and diverse understanding of the movements of women's literary production, of theoretical developments, of radical histories, and of 20th century literature more broadly? Rukeyser's unfinished texts also help us better understand, contextualize, and connect the work she did get published, illustrating how she worked around a censorious establishment in order to move her ideas into the world, sometimes reusing the same material in different forms repeatedly until it reached an audience, repeatedly for decades until it reached an audience. The proliferating nature of her writing was a direct result of the ways in which her work was being received, but also an indication of her insistent radical impulse to keep alive the movements of political and social transformation that occurred in the 1930s, even as the literary and political norms of the 40s and 50s were trying to stop them, trying to halt the, quote, restless forward motion of modernism, as the critic Louise Bogan described it. Writing for the Atlantic Monthly in 1947, the conservative American poet and theorist Peter Viereck announced a new critical era. He said, "The spirit of revolt is over, the revolt against poetic forms and disciplines." This supposedly obsolete spirit of revolt against literary and political orthodoxies had been essential for women writers, who were perhaps its most productive and inventive avatars. In Feminist Aesthetics and the Politics of Modernism, Eva Ziererek writes that women suffragists in the early 20th century defined the struggle for the right to vote as the right to revolt, and argues that our understanding of modernism as a radical and experimental site for political and linguistic upheaval only becomes legible when we read women's writing of the period. And in their 1986 introduction to the female imagination and modernist aesthetics, Sandra Gilbert and Susan Guber similarly recuperated women writers' pivotal position to modernism, describing their problematic relationship with, quote, the tradition of authority, as well as the authority of tradition. as the major precursors to all 20th century modernists. Women were the avant-garde of the avant-garde. However, by the late 1940s, women writers once considered key figures in the 1920s and 30s modernist movements. Writers as varied as Mina Loy and Josephine Herbst and Zora Neale Hurston, among many others, saw their work fall out of print or struggle to get new work published. In Mary Helen Washington's recent book, The Other Blacklist, African-American Literary and Cultural Left of the 1950s, she writes of how it took Gwendolyn Brooks nearly the entire 1940s to get her, quote, Black leftist feminist modernist novel of the Cold War, Maud Martha, published, receiving rejection after rejection, which echoed Rukeyser's experience. Publishers called Maud Martha, quote, too hampered with self-consciousness and, quote, more suited for poetry than prose. Women's exclusion from the literary marketplace, from canon making, and from cultural institutions was often carried out under the nominal charge of, quote, aesthetic failure or, quote, political naivete. In actuality, the suppression of women within these spheres reflected a broader cultural animus towards feminists, lesbians, and single mothers, and against women who articulated views that ran contrary to both left and right political orthodoxies, or who pursued the sorts of theoretically abstract and formally inventive projects that Bogan deemed, quote, unnatural in women writers. I'll return to Bogan in a minute. One can't stop with her. Thinking about gender in this period leads us to revise how we define and constitute radical politics and its relations to, quote, revolutions in artistic forms, since many women writers were unaligned or unaffiliated radicals, making them, as Rukeyser wrote, vulnerable to both sides. Understanding Rukeyser's vulnerable position in this period is essential for understanding the period itself. As recent studies have shown, Cold War cultural institutions, from literary prizes to museums to literary magazines, were funded by the CIA through the Congress of Cultural Freedom, as well as the British Council and the Information Research Office in the UK. These outlets were used to justify the making of new literary landscapes, effectively constraining the scope of pre-war modernist literature to conform to the political and aesthetic agenda of a Cold War literary canon. Al Fielris demonstrates brilliantly in Counter-Revolution of the Word how radical modernism, the impulse to join both aesthetic experimentation and left-aligned radicalism, was effectively suppressed in the post-war years, as many, quote, heretical writers were being rejected automatically by publishers and editors, not because of a deficiency of literary quality, but because they had been dared being critical of prevailing political and cultural reaction. Most importantly, Fielris shows how the political and aesthetic aims of the Cold War were bound together. Modernism, he quotes Gilbert Malcolm Fee's writing, has lasted much too long and behaved like a totalitarian dictator gone to seed. And he demonstrates how formal experimentation was dubbed bad poetry in order to enact a restoration of language and suppress the avant-garde, even the idea of the avant-garde. In looking at Rukeyser's unfinished text, I show how gender complicates this Cold War reshaping of the literary landscape and of the persistence of a radical avant-garde. Because at the same moment that saw the, quote, general pattern of mid-century efforts to forget or conspire to repress both radical left poets of the 1930s and revolutions of the words from the 1940s, also saw women's newly won pre-war roles in the public sphere under attack as part of Cold War political and aesthetic programs intent on reshaping women's bodies and voices. What happens and continues to happen to the women writers who invented new modes that not only couldn't be defined by 20th century binaries and boundaries, but actively defied them? Let's see, did I have my PowerPoint? Oh yeah, okay. Rukeyser was keenly aware of the ways that reactionary political and cultural projects betrayed themselves through their attitudes towards women. After a series of sexist reviews from Bogan and Oscar Williams in the New Republic, and on the heels of the partisan review in Broglio, in which a series of anonymous reviewers attacked her work, she wrote in a 1944 letter to Myra Zaturanska, quote, I think the whole thing has been reactionary in the extreme. a good sign of other reaction, and may very well be dealt with as such. My feeling is that when war becomes as horrible as it can be, the spectacle of a woman involved in war no longer is ridiculous. No matter how the critics and the fairies feel about women writing, when moral and intellectual life reaches such a point, its signs are in its attitudes towards women. What she identifies here, the attitudes towards women, as symptomatic of the reactionary climate, tells us important things, not only about how and when we might define the quote conservative turn, since she's talking about how women are being read as writers during World War II, not to mention how women understood the vulnerability of their work on the literary marketplace more broadly, but that Rukeyser herself had a clear understanding about how gender functioned in context of political and cultural projects, a theoretical position she develops in the subsequent decades. This does not mean she doesn't have an uncomplicated relationship with gender, as you can see where she talks about the fairies. And she has an amazing point in this letter where she says that Bogan's problems as a critic would be fixed if she, quote, had a sex hormone injected into her. So I think there's a real sense of the pervasiveness about how much gender was part of these discussions. I'm going to talk a little bit about one example, which was Oscar Williams' review. It is entitled, of all things, called Ladies' Day in the New Republic. And it opens by noting that he's writing about women poets because, quote, most of the male poets are in the armed services, and goes on to refer to the publication of the first part of H.D.'s astonishing epic trilogy, and Marion Moore's Nevertheless, as, quote, little books. Williams then spends 2 paragraphs backhandedly praising Rukeyser in a way that equates her poetic line with her physical body, writing that her, quote, general fault is an overabundance of material. In the midst of one poem, she habitually begins another, and that the, quote, rhythmic shapes she uses are much like the planks being tested by the foot of an elephant about to cross a chasm. Rukeyser's response to Williams, not particularly subtle conflation of gender and genre norms, was to write an angry letter stating, quote, you have written like some frightened hack who loves neither poetry nor women. And if you go over your review, you will see how many positive attributes of creativity you have attacked as faults. This question about the misreading of women's positive creative attributes as faults is an essential element to how Rukeyser theorizes containment culture as gendered and aesthetic culture. In doing so, she develops the kind of feminist analysis that scholars and writers would further elaborate in the 70s and 80s. That is, one which highlights the creative attributes that are disparaged in women precisely because they expose or confront the systemic inequalities that form the basis of their disparagement. In many keys, Rukeyser describes the ways in which women's aesthetic choices are so often misread as hesitation and inexperience, and goes on to highlight how that misreading means we miss the radical potential of women's writing. In her collaboration with Abbott, she shows how a, quote, failure to see leads to the intellectual waste and creative amputation she describes in The Life of Poetry. How critics feel about women writers at mid-century then is a manifestation of other political and cultural reactions. Rukeyser shows us that understanding the reaction to women writers in the period is essential for understanding the larger codes of Cold War literary and cultural suppression more broadly. These codes found an authoritative voice in Louise Bogan. And I know we're all talking about Louise Bogan. It's hard not to, so I don't want to take up too much time about it. She held the powerful position of poetry editor of The New Yorker from 1931 to 1969. And she deployed a particularly virulent form of explicitly gendered new criticism. Bogan had been crafting an anti-feminist and anti-radical argument around women writers for decades, one that echoed long-standing assessments of women's poetry, and by extension, women, as anti-intellectual. One of her most famous poems begins with the line, "Women have no wilderness in them." And in her 1947 essay, The Heart of the Liar, she attempts to extrapolate genre attributes from women's lived experiences, writing that, quote, women are capable of a perfect and poignant song, though she may never compose an epic or tragic drama in 5 acts, the woman poet has her singular role and precious destiny. Bogan's ideas correlate neatly to the gender norms of the period. a reflection of a culture that privileged the physical smallness of the domesticated housewife of mid-century, whose apotheosis was self-effacement at home and on the page. Bogan's literary historicizing is complicated though, for she herself did not fit into that mold either. And in fact, her power as a critic was diminished because of the gender assessment of women's literary value that she herself deployed. While Bogan worked to give women writers a place in a literary canon that was forming around the work of a particularly small group of male writers, she also made those women appear non-threatening by delineating poetic forms that arose from subordination and that did not challenge male supremacy. Bogan's Negotiation is a good example of the ways in which women make careers for themselves through compromise and complicity, but it also shows us that the rhetorical mechanisms through which women can exist in the canon without transforming it. Rukeyser offered a divergent but often parallel path with Bogan in how she negotiated, or ultimately failed to negotiate, her career. Read next to each other, they are interesting studies in women's artistic agency and why detailing Bogan's assessment of Rukeyser is so important for understanding the political and aesthetic crises of the period itself. Bogan crystallizes this in her Achievement of American Poetry, which was her part of the canon making of the 1940s and 50s, published just after Rukeyser's The Life of Poetry. In Achievement, she uses Rukeyser as an example of political and aesthetic, quote, incoherence, under the chapter heading, I'm not kidding, Ideology and Irrationalism. Bogan writes of Rukeyser that her, quote, style, an amalgam of modern styles, was almost wholly unrelieved by moments of clarity, or her seriousness by moments of lightness. As a result, her argument was not able to project itself with force, and her long poems failed in impact because of dramatic as well as structural incoherence. Rukeyser is one of the few poets introduced in Bogan's canon as an example of bad practice, and she is only one of a handful of women writers in the book overall. This is to note that Rukeyser's position in the newly forming Cold War canon is that of in and out at the same time, brought in only to be excluded. Bogan returns to Rukeyser again and again in her New Yorker column, only to pan her work consistently, describing it in various ways as incoherent or superficial. Louise Curtis wonders in her book why Bogan didn't simply refrain from mentioning Rukeyser's books in her New Yorker column. But it is clear why she does. At every juncture where Bogan declared that modernism's, quote, restless forward motion had ended, Muriel Rukeyser would continue to push the spirit of revolt forward. Rukeyser's response to Bogan's continual attack on her was to write that she had constructed, quote, an attack on a group of she poets on the grounds that they are she poets, and that not even Bogan herself would survive. In a 1942 letter to Horace Gregory, Rukeyser succinctly narrates the experience of women on literary marketplaces at mid-century. This is one of the best things I've found in the archive. She writes, while you were away, I switched from Viking to Doubleday for everything. I read the Doubleday People of the Wake Island poem with no thought of book publication, and they wanted to print right away. Viking had turned down the John Brown as not being a book length, and this is shorter than JB. But Pat was angry when he knew Doubleday was going to print. That's Pat Covici of Covici Fried. And I expect he's even angrier at this new turn. I haven't spoken to him. The whole thing was done through Curtis Brown. But Pat is so hipped on Steinbeck. I told him I was beginning a play and he said, fine, you could write it in novel form like Mice and Men. And Marshall Bass and Ginsberg are so awful about everything I want to do that I felt very dreary about the connection. It was Bass who told me at a party that I was a nice girl, but had too many ideas. That was when I first spoke to him about the Gibbs. They turned that down, and the Vassar lectures, and the John Brown, sidestepping each time and trying to keep some sort of hold, hoping for a novel, I think. Now, I hope to try a good many forms, but I haven't the slightest to do with a novel. One about my friends is what they kept suggesting. I sent it in 3 pages, a little object called Ordeal by Muriel to Curtis Brown in case they really wanted to see one. I'm really proud of the first sentence. It begins, there were footprints all over the sheets that morning, and it is about a publisher who longs for a 2-headed son, a brilliant first novel about literary life in New York and the world battlefronts. Despite being identified at the time by Rukeyser, gender politics are often missing from current scholarship about the anti-modernist conservative literary turn at mid-century and the development of the anti-radical Cold War culture that has informed both our attitudes towards sex, texts, and towards women, and the ways in which a literary discipline was built around those attitudes. For example, if you follow the legacy of Harold Ginsburg, the co-founder of Viking, who Rukeyser writes about above, you'll find that his son went on to be the first managing editor of the Paris Review, whose most recent general editor, Lauren Stein, resigned after a series of Me Too exposés about his pervasive sexual harassment of women authors, a reflection of the magazine's historical biases against publishing women writers. These are important genealogies for understanding the persistence of Cold War literary legacies on who and what gets published and read. In Caliban and the Witch, Silvia Federici reasserts that the feminist vision is to, quote, redefine in fundamental ways the accepted historical categories and make visible hidden structures of domination and exploitation. In thinking about women's literary history, in thinking about the boundaries of modernism, and in thinking about women's artistic production more broadly, our task is still to make visible those structures of humiliation and domination that's censored, but also to make available texts and ideas that allow for new ways of seeing, interpreting, and confronting those histories. Rukeyser's unfinished texts help us do that. So to end at the beginning, what if it had been the Rukeyser era and not the Pound era? What if Rukeyser's theories of aesthetics and politics shaped our post-war thinking and not Adorno's? What if the 20th century literary canon was made by Rukeyser, who described herself in the 70s as a, quote, vulgar optimist, and that the most exciting and field-expanding and politically radical work was being written by women. And in that letter, she talks about how Black women were at the forefront of the avant-garde. What if the ideas we use to think other ideas with, as the anthropologist Marilyn Strathern wrote, are about the, quote, regret for waste and the wild knowledge of growth and sorrow and discovery, as she writes in the first elegy. Through Rukeyser's unfinished work, through her ontological unfinishedness, we can find radical openings, revisions, and connections. Through the waste and all her polymorphic and contradictory uses of the term, signifying the lost and suppressed, the unused and undervalued, the dead of war and the ruins of imperialism, the biological and bodily matter we shed and share, we are offered a new way for thinking and being and reading. What if the spirit of our age is an unfinishing one, neither fixed or closed, but polyphonic and polymorphous? And what if we thought and taught through that? Thank you. Tiny clapping.
There are an awful lot of participants in this webinar, and every single person, I'm sure, is vigorously applauding right now. Thank you so much, Rowena.
My God,
that was
yes.
fantastic.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
Yes.
I think, I think there's going to be a lot of questions. There's comments there saying applause, applause, that was amazing, brilliant. Lots of people in the chat. I'm going to ask you, yes, like way too many for me to read actually, so I'll let you enjoy those. I'm going to ask everyone to think of questions. The panelists can raise their hands, obviously, and the attendees could type a question in the Q&A bubble, not the chat bubble. I think it just gets a little bit confusing for me and the co-hosts and everyone else. Yes, incredible, eloquent, yes, all of these things. Rowena, I'm going to start, I think, just by asking you, I've got a lot of questions to ask you. Perhaps I could start with that concept of waste. Again, I'm really fascinated by this. I think it's a really, really important and interesting kind of concept and conceit to kind of hang the whole book on, really. And it just got me thinking about what waste means for Rukeyser, and what it has meant in past kind of theoretical formulations, especially to do with gender and gendered bodies. So sometimes the first place you go when you think about, you know, waste and feminism is the kind of abject and favor. But what we're doing here is something different. We're talking about the unfulfilled being the unfinished, and something is produced but not used, and use is such a key word for Rukeyser. And Rukeyser really kind of lives this, she witnesses it. And the quote that you gave from Many Keys really resonated with me. She says, "The making of poetry works against waste." And I guess this kind of brings me back to the focus of the conference, which is, of course, Rukeyser's Elegies. And to think about waste in terms of loss, and kind of lament. There's a lot of waste in the elegies, especially in the 6th elegy, isn't there? I did a bit of a search last night. But also in terms of witness. So, you know, I think Rukeyser often writes at that intersection between, you know, loss and witness, and the social and the embodied, you know, in the way that, you know, poets like Audre Lorde do, and Forget, and also in that understanding that in the unfinished is not just loss, but hope, and not just, to use the words that you were using, not just regret, but discovery.
Yeah,
I know discovery is massive for you and your work. So I was just wondering if you could talk just a little bit more about Rukeyser's understanding of waste in those terms, and how it relates to loss, but also growth.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I guess I didn't realize how much I had to say about waste until I was like at the end of the book. And I was like, wow, this has become the central thing. And I think 2 things happened when I was looking at her Boaz material, and the poem she started producing after traveling to Vancouver Island and doing kind of deep research into Boaz's stuff around mass and Indigenous practices. And that she has a suite of poems that comes out in poetry. And one of them is The Place of Alert Bay, and one of them is called A Birth, and she talks about the waste that is never waste. And I was like, oh, it's a placenta. And then I was like, right, it's the thing you produce, you grow, and then you grow it only to produce life, and then you discard it. But it's the most important thing you could do, right? You have to produce that. And then I realized that this is all over her work. And then I read Donna Haraway's newest book, Staying with the Trouble, all about the fertilizer and the compost. And I was like, wait, Rukeyser was writing about the fertilizer in Willard Gibbs, right? That's what she's been doing. And so the whole notion of the seed, of the things we produce to become who we are, to move forward, the processes of our lives are about the way. So then all of a sudden the whole thing about the book was kind of like became revelatory for me, and thinking about women's relationship to the detritus of our lives, of production of bodily life, of all the ways we produce and aren't recognized for it, reproductive politics. But actually that is the avant-garde. That is the moment of kind of creating a radical consciousness, and that she's doing all of that. So on the one hand, it is saying, yes, the archival waste is this space that we can find new meanings from, right? Quite literally, we go in, these are things that didn't get published or have been pushed aside for whatever reason, and that is an experience for women. But then it became kind of, I was like, oh, she's been theorizing this. And so when I began to think about what it meant for her to be the theorist of the 20th century, it would be someone who says that in the waste and the ruins, isn't this like the Benjaminian kind of chaos? It's the place of growth. And of course, she had many contemporaries who thought that HD has a similar kind of theory. But I think she extrapolates it and uses it in many different texts. So she has this whole thing in Willard Gibbs where she talks about the wasteful as nature and prodigal. She says it multiple times. And I realized that maybe is why she's one of the most important 20th century thinkers, because she understood something before Haraway or Irigaray or Kristeva about what those bodily wasted affects and lives and materials meant. Yeah, that was a lot of information. A lot of things.
That was fantastic, and yeah, I mean, I really agree. And that and Eric says nicely formulated, which is praise indeed. I'll come back to Eric's comment. I can't see it all for the moment, but I see a question in the Q&A which is related to something I would love you to
I see the Keynote too. Oh yeah, okay, yeah.
Expand on a little bit more as well, which is the idea of the Rukeyser era. And it got me thinking about, that line that Kenneth Rexroth is, the line from Kenneth Rexroth that is always printed on, on Rukeyser books, was that she was the best poet of her exact generation.
Yeah.
Like, and what you just described so beautifully is that, she doesn't have an exact generation, but she was certainly before her time. But it was then, it is now, and unfinished as it is also the future. So Eulalia, I hope I've pronounced that correctly, would like you to talk a little bit more about the Rukeyser era. And she asks, have we lost this era?
No, I think we are in it.
We're in it right now.
We are in the Rukeyser era, maybe thanks to all of you who do so much work in making Rukeyser visible. But the more I thought about the crisis we are in now, the more I thought we are certainly have approached this moment for her work, not just as a poet, which is in this, my book is focuses on not on her poetry, and I've basically not been focused on her poetry, but that's not important, but her larger theoretical work in prose writing is so exciting. So I think we are actually upon the Rukeyser era. We are coming to it or amidst it right now. So I don't think we've lost it, and I think we can reformulate. I do deeply think if we have these materials, we can reformulate how we kind of understand the movements of the past in more exciting and nuanced ways.
Yeah, agreed. Absolutely agreed. And I'm all for living in an unending Rukeyser era, the long Rukeyser era. There are a couple there it is. There are a couple of slightly more kind of personal questions that people want to know about, how you got into Rukeyser. But perhaps before we go there, could I just ask you to tell us a little bit more about Rukeyser's own responses? I mean, those of us who've dug around in the archives do, have encountered some quite heartbreaking diary entries and letters of her reactions to the reception that she got, this, the extreme sexism and but you mentioned something just before we went live, actually, about Rukeyser's response to a particular rejection. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, that and the connection between response and revolt.
So I was talking about after Horace Gregory had rejected Savage Coast, there was a series of letters between her and Gregory about the novel. And one of my favorite things, she says, it's not a novel and I won't make it composed like one. And it's a tale told. And so she reasserts, so it's confusing because she, on the draft of Savage Coast, of course it says Savage Coast, a novel, as she was trying to revise it. But I think her original intent was to really write a modernist hybrid narrative that was doing all the things she was interested in, impressionistic, avant-garde, documentary. And so her and Gregory go back and forth, and she's basically like, this is my vision. I'm going to try to do it. If Kavichi Fried doesn't want it, I'm going to try to peddle it to someone else. So I felt like her first response to that rejection, which was her first major rejection, as far as I can tell, that was so devastating, like this work will not go, was that it reaffirmed her desire to figure out a new way to communicate a new kind of formal space. And then she starts to write all these other things that are pretty out there, right? I mean, she starts doing these lectures where she begins to theorize all of these things. She starts on the Willard Gibbs projects, again, formally innovative. She writes formally innovative poems. So I think it was interesting to see her as really sticking to her guns. And Gregory was such an important figure. He helped her have connections. He helped her do publications. He had a lot of power in that period. And she asserted that this was her aesthetic choice. She knew what she was doing. So it was kind of a really wonderful thing to read. And it went over many letters. They went back and forth about it. So anyways, that was that. What else was I answering about that? Was that it?
There was actually a hand up.
Questions coming up.
There was a hand up.
Yeah,
there was a hand up. That was Margaret.
I also saw that. Was it Margaret had a hand up?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. I just
Thank
typed
you.
in the chat. I just Catherine, you like totally read my mind in this like most wonderful way in asking about waste and then use. These were exactly my questions. So I just typed in the chat. This reminds me so much of the discussion in Life of Poetry when she says it is necessary that the 25th century know that we wrote trash. The trash and waste here feels to me so
Yeah.
useful and workable in this particular way. So I just think I really appreciated that quotation that you pulled from Many Keys about how poetry works against waste. And for me, the key word there, I think, is work. How exactly does that work take place? So
Absolutely.
thank you so much.
Yeah.
Mm. And thank you very much, Margaret. And Vivian, you had your
Well, I mean, I think we can agree this was super fabulous, and that theorizing waste as you're doing, it's amazing, and theorizing fatness. I think I mentioned that I'm currently working on Rukeyser and Whitman, and we all know how much she adored Whitman, even if she said he's a bad influence. Um, I'm so interested in the homophobia that pops up from time to time when she's describing men she doesn't like. And I'm not sure how to think about that, because one of her most interesting approaches to Whitman is to see him as someone who is biologically conditioned to be, I don't know if we want to use a term like androgynous or if we want to use a term like gay. I mean, there really isn't, a vocabulary of praise that she's importing, but she certainly is not talking about Whitman as a fairy, and yet she writes tremendously eloquently about her interpretation of Edgar Lee Masters' book on Whitman, where we have Whitman's autopsy. They're autopsying his brain, and people get very interested in glands. It's a big thing. We know from Yeats, for example, and others at the time. And she's really interested in whether there's a biological basis to what we would now call gayness. So, I mean, I just wonder if you could frame these now cringe-making references to fairies um, in ways you're encouraging us to consider.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting. Well, I guess my first response to it was how much she was trafficking in some of these gender ideologies herself. And what that, I guess, how we should all, what that means for all of us as we think about a time period that everyone was using these ideas about really flat ideas about gender and sexuality in the period, even though at the same time they might not have been. I guess my other thinking, and I feel like maybe Eric could talk about this too a little bit, is about kind of the pervasiveness of like the Auden generation as gatekeepers. And I think her response to that, and I'm assuming her response is that's about Delmore Schwartz and that career a little bit in that letter. So I'm not sure if I have I don't know if I have a good way to theorize it, because I feel like it's really interesting that someone who's probably also sleeping with women at the time was using this kind of language to, I mean, even the idea of injecting a sex hormone into Louise Bogan, right? So to me, what that said was how circulating these ideas were, even to the most radical people, so it's like what we know about the left, right? The left had lots of great ideologies. It was a super sexist and racist place, super homophobic at times, right? So to me, it really exposed, as I went through the letters, what that period was like in some ways. But I don't know if I haven't fully, I'd love to talk to people more about how to think about how one's own subjectivity and sexual desires and Rukeyser's kind of anti-binaries met against other kind of cultural norms that she was trafficking in. it's an interesting issue. I felt like I both had to include that. I didn't want to like whitewash her own participation in it. But I also was like, wow, it's interesting to think about how everyone was kind of using these norms and how they understood them as in relation to criticism and literary production. I mean, that's what's most interesting, right? They were always in context of literary outputs. So it kind of affirmed my feeling that gender was so central to the Cold War moment.
Thank you. So there are 3 hands up, and there's also 4 hands up if I include Louise's real hand. And there's also a question in the Q&A, which is probably a little linked to this in terms of intersectionality and Rukeyser's Jewishness. And one of the attendees would like you to speak a little bit more about that. Perhaps we can loop back to that. I think Trudy had her hand up first, and then Eric. There's a lot of people who want to speak.
Should I answer some of the Q&A questions?
The Q&A questions, the one that there's the intersectionality, the Jewish one.
And then the one.
Yes.
Oh, there's 2 more that's just come in. Sorry,
Okay.
I didn't see that. There's Eulalia again.
Well, the Jewish question, this does come up in my book more. Maybe Bill can talk about it. He made a really good comment after reading my book about the tradition that she saw herself in as a kind of a secular Jewish tradition. Bill, do you want to speak to that at all?
Yeah, she definitely, and clearly in things like Letter to the Front and Akiba, not only felt but expressed her Jewish identity and celebrated it. She felt very ambivalent about formal religion, and she would tell stories about her upbringing and her childhood, how on one hand she felt that her parents were being controlling and bordering on oppressive, insisting that she go to Temple Emmanuel every Saturday. But on the other hand, she portrayed her mother as being very understanding in terms of Muriel's not interested in the ceremony and the the other formal aspects. And so what you can do is, while you're sitting there, you can read the Bible as literature. So it was one thing and another, but in terms of labels, how she would identify herself, we've talked today and yesterday about how she rejected or at least modified labels as applied to her. She would never do that with Judaism, but, and there's always a but here, during her relationship with Monica McCall, and perhaps preceding that, I don't know, but during her relationship with Monica McCall, she did have an interesting and very extended flirtation with Episcopalianism. Now, how that relates to a strong Jewish identity, I'm not even going to speculate, but it struck me at the time as being one of those contradictions that was inherent in Muriel.
Could I chime in a little bit? Because I know in my class, when I asked students to choose poems, Ronan Sampson, who is here, also chose the poem Judas that she wrote. I'm not entirely, I think that was also around the 40s and 50s. And even in Elegies, she refers to herself as a dark woman. And she has these images of the black beast with my eyes. And so I feel like that she leaves these little clues about how fragile she felt about being a Jew in America, how she was clearly aware in the 60s and 70s of being considered white, but I think she was also very much aware of the history, and in the 30s and 40s, of course, of not really being white, and dealing with that, really dealing with a lot of the prejudices and the constructions of Jews, particularly Jewish women, I would say, in her poetry, but doing it always, like I always say, there are always these little clues in her poems. She doesn't say it directly. For instance, in Ode, Elegy and Joy, the landscape he gives us, yes, it's America, but the shadowed blue and the gold. I also see Israel. In Water Lily Fire, the city is New York, but it's also Jerusalem. So, I mean, there are these many different levels, I think, where she brings that in. And this is one of my questions for New Directions of Rukeyser research.
If I can just jump in to add one more footnote, there's this back and forth in terms of her self-image and idealization, etc. Rowena was talking about body form. Muriel would often say in a half-joking manner, well, when I'm thin and blonde, ... And, I always kind of associated that with her flirtation with Episcopalianism. I don't know how accurate that is. I don't know if there's anything in the written record that you've seen, Rowena, or anybody else, but those are verbal clues. It's unclear to me how big they are.
Can I say something? It is 12:14 and we're actually supposed to start our little coffee break talking about New Directions in Rukeyser studies during our Zoom. And would it be okay if we continue this fascinating conversation that Rowena's work has started, and it will enable all of us to speak freely? And
absolutely.
Yeah.
I think my watch is slower than yours, Elizabeth. I have
mine is fast.
12 on mine. So I wanted to squeeze another one in, but that sounds great to me, and I'm sure a lot of people want to continue the discussion with Rowena. And I'm sorry that we didn't get to all of the questions in the box, but I think some of Rowena's answers at least answered parts of most of the questions that were asked. So I'm very happy to do that. Elizabeth, do we have a link for the next one, or do we?
Yes, Casey will provide the link, and Stefania Heim will be the facilitator of our conversations about New Directions. And I mean, thank you so much. Obviously, I feel bad. We could have just done this, but I hope we'll continue. And I hope you join.